on a pretty regular basis or add to the standards of practice in the Code of Ethics. And they amended the Standard of Practice 16-3 in 2004. You can say you can see where it's amended in January of 2004. We actually voted on it at the NAR meetings in November of 2003. And this amendment came about because if you have someone come to an open house or call you or contact you, if they contact you and say, well, my house is currently listed, but I'm looking for another house to buy, you are allowed to represent them as long as they are not under a buyer-broker agreement with their current agent. And sometimes their listing agent doesn't understand that the contract for services that they have is only for listing their property, not for representing them to purchase. So don't be afraid to represent somebody like that. However, you must ask every principal you come in contact with whether they have an agreement in writing with another real estate agent. And you can't say realtor per se, because realtor is a trademarked word and only refers to members of the National Association of Realtors. But a real estate licensee or a real estate agent is okay for you to ask. And that is something that you have to ask when you're on floor time, when you're talking to somebody at an open house. Do you have an agreement in writing with another real estate professional?
So it has to be in writing.
It has to be in writing. Oral agreements are as good as the paper they're written on.
That's good.
Well, Gabriella had an example of that just last week. The person that called up and wanted to see the property, and he's working with another agent.
Yes.
Remember?
Yes.
I'll explain that to Sandi.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's
well,
standard.
Basically, he had already put an offer on another property.
And he called you to look at
Well,
something
I
else?
told you that
I was at
initially.
an open house, and he wanted to see the property next door.
Oh.
So I took him there, and spent a lot of time talking to him, and then finally he said, well, I have to tell you, you're so nice and you're so professional. I have to tell you, I already put an offer on another property, but I'm not too sure. So that's what he said. I wanted to see this one too.
Well, and
I have asked him, the first thing I ask is, are you working with anybody else?
he said,
No.
see, that's the
Yeah.
part that you can't
Mhm.
control, is when people lie to you.
Yeah.
On the other hand, right, just because he had made an offer with a different agent doesn't mean he has a buyer brokerage with them.
No, but he has an agency
But he,
agreement.
Yeah. He
So
already signed. Yeah.
yes, so he has an agency agreement. He doesn't have a buyer brokerage. So let's, as long as we're there, let's just talk about that for a minute. The agency agreement that has been signed is not property specific, right? And it does not necessarily mean, it depends on it. If it's somebody working with South Bay Brokers, they probably have a buyer brokerage agreement signed, because that's our requirement here at South Bay Brokers, right? When you represent a buyer, you have at the very least the buyer representation agreement signed by your buyer.
So you would do that before you show property?
Well, we'll get to that.
Okay.
But when somebody comes into your open house and says, oh, and lies to you, no, I don't have anything in writing.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have representation.
Yeah.
This is one of the things that I find it kind of hard. And a long time ago, I used to find it a lot harder to say, you scumbag. And now I find a way to say it in a different way, because I've had to find a different way that is basically, you misrepresented yourself to me when you came in.
Yeah.
And that
Big time.
yeah, that's not good for you as a class of people, which is buyer. If you're going to lie to me when you come in here and tell me you don't have an agent.
How do you deal with it though after the whole?
Well, the first thing is,
how is this done?
well, it will happen, and the first thing is, for protection purposes, as far as I'm concerned, when you're a woman doing a public open house, and my husband gets a little bit every once in a while when there's news articles, my husband gets a little bit hysterical. First of all, I think you have to decide what your security measures are before you go into an open house. Where you're going to leave your purse, and it's not in the open house, and all those kinds of things. And then you just follow the pattern. Okay, so when someone comes into the house, what do? Do you just stand there and say, "Oh, hi," or do you put out your hand and say, "Hi, I'm Sandy," and force them to give you a name that you will remember and you will write down? And you whatever your security procedures are for yourself. And then even if they lie to you and say, "Oh, well, I am purchasing," you ask them, "Who is your agent?" And if they say to you, "Yes, I do have an agent," great. Who is it? I might know them. Even if you don't know them, find out who that person is, what their name is, because eventually you will get to know most of the people in the South Bay who work for a long time in real estate. So find out who that person is, and then call that agent later on that day or the next day and say, "Just wanted to let you know your client so-and-so was in my open house yesterday and seems to not be sure about whether or not they want to buy that property."
Oh, okay.
That agent will be very glad that you called them, whether or not they have a buyer-broker agreement. But it is imperative that you remind yourself that when you start talking to people, you have to assume that 50-50, that they could have an agreement in writing with somebody else, with another real estate agent. It could be me. It could be somebody in your office, and they just got you because you're on floor time, or they thought that agent was going to be at the open house. But you must ask them, according to the Code of Ethics, whether they have an agreement in writing with another agent. If they say no, and they want to see property, then you get to the buyer-broker agreement. So when you go to the chart that we have here, there are 3 buyer-broker agreements that California Association of Realtors has put together for us, and the reason that there are 3 is because there have been so many objections around California to raising the professionalism. So consequently, the way that Sunny has put them together is when you look at the chart, the top agreement in this group is on the right. The next agreement is the second one in your pack, and then the first one, the one that's on the left, is the buyer representation agreement. You can see that the way that I've done the chart is the right to represent. I compared all of these to pretty much our listing agreements here in California, and our listing agreements have levels of your right to get paid. And so do our buyer-broker agreements, because you are listing, so to speak, a buyer. And I've said for probably about 10 years now that eventually we will get to the point, and I know that some of our MLSs are getting to the point where they are making it possible for us to list our buyers in the multiple listing service. So that when you get a buyer and you start working with a buyer who says, okay, I want a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, at least 1,600 square feet, ocean view, south side of the street, whatever, big yard, minimum number of square footage in the lot, you can list that buyer on the multiple listing service, and then people who have those kinds of properties would be the same thing as us looking for properties that are for sale. Someone who has a client who's looking for a buyer, let's go check to see how many buyers are looking for this kind of a property. Mm-hmm. And that is something that I know a guy in Minnesota has been working on for a long time. So if you want to list a buyer and get paid, how do you do that? The buyer representation agreement that South Bay Brokers asks us to sign, you can see the very first grid here is that this contract is revocable by either party with written notice. Now, it's good for a year, but you can revoke it, and so can the buyer, as long as they do it in writing within that 1-year period of time. But the bigger thing I think about this agreement is that there is no